All right, hey everybody, Miss Lynch here, and I'm back for the second half of Chapter 22's lecture. Okay, so hopefully you're just picking up from where you were. Okay, last thing I had talked about was we were looking at World War II, but everything that was going on everywhere else except for the United States, okay? And I left off by starting to switch over to mention the home front, which refers to the United States. Okay, so what was going on in the United States during the war? Sorry, smear. Okay, so the home front, that's what we're going to talk about. All right. Okay, and yes, I was going to repeat those things, but I won't. Okay. First things first, let's talk about women at work. Okay. Alrighty, so the war saw an unprecedented mobilization of what was referred to as woman power for industrial jobs, which makes sense. As soldiers are going overseas, there's a need to fill these industrial positions, so naturally women would take over that. Okay, but so this mobilization of woman power, quote unquote, represents the World War II era. Yeah, exactly. So the image of Rosie the Riveter becomes synonymous with working women during the war. And so by 1944, remember this is 1941, marks the beginning of U.S. involvement. 1944 really marks the true bulk of U.S. involvement in the war, okay? And so 1944, 350,000 women had served in auxiliary military units. So that is nursing, that is production, okay? So everything not on the battlefield itself, okay? This provided new opportunities outside of clerical work. And these new opportunities opened up for married women and mothers, jobs that had previously been restricted to men, and this addressed workers' rights for women within unions. Okay, women's work during the war was viewed by men and the government as temporary. It was just a wartime fix, and it was not considered to be an extension of women's freedom, okay? And yeah, basically all these women who went to work in these jobs that we're talking about lost them at the end of the war as soldiers returned home, and then women returned home to the physical house and domicile that they lived in, okay? Which we will talk about that more whenever we get into the Cold War and kind of that regression of feminization that happens during that time. Okay, but so this is women during the war. Women are taking a lot of jobs that had not been opened up to them, but needed to be filled because of what's going on, okay? All right, so let's look at the Bracero program. It's a project. But so the Bracero program, as it was referred to, allowed tens of thousands of contract laborers to cross into the United States to take up jobs as domestic and agricultural workers. Again, as soldiers are going overseas, there's a need to maintain production. So this was viewed as a way of doing that. And under this program, 4.5 million people would come to the United States to work. This offered new opportunities for Mexican American women, and the image of Rosie the Riveter was, this also applied to these women, and so Rosita the Riveter is kind of the personification that came about, okay? All right, during this time, there is a new Chicano culture that develops. This is a fusion of Mexican heritage and American experience, and it was kind of, if you ever see like Zoot Suits, if you hear about Zoot Suit riots, all of that, this is what this is talking about. But so a lot of that imagery was the oversized suits, pinstriped, okay? But so there's a series of riots that specifically centers around, our groups. This is really like a youth movement, okay? So this is teenagers, early 20s people, okay? But so Zoot Suit riots, sailors and police attacked Mexican-American youths in Los Angeles, okay? So whenever you hear about the Zoot Suit riots, that's what this refers to. And also it is important to note that during the war, approximately 500,000 Mexican-American men and women served in the armed forces, okay? So involved in the war effort. Okay, moving along. Let us look at First Americans and Asian Americans during the war. Okay, so for First Americans, again, served in the Army in different capacities. And something that is pretty unique that comes about is the Navajo Code Talkers. So this was a form of inscribing messages in Navajo so that the Germans couldn't dictate it. Okay, but so that comes about. And 250,000 individuals would leave reservations during the war to take on jobs in war industries. So all of these production jobs that I've been mentioning, okay? So for Asian Americans, their war experience was filled with paradox. Chinese exclusion was abolished, which is something that we talked about pretty early on. This comes about in the late, mid 1800s. Okay, so it's abolished during the war. And 50,000 Asian Americans would serve in the U.S. military during World War II. Okay, so for Japanese Americans, they had a far different experience. A substantial majority of Japanese Americans were, in fact, American-born, thus making them U.S. citizens. 70% of whom lived in California. I'm going to the next slide. Okay, but unlike German Americans or Italian Americans, Japanese Americans were viewed as potential spies. And we have the process of Japanese American internment that comes about. Okay, so the military persuaded FDR to issue what is known as Executive Order 9066. This relocated 110,000 Japanese Americans to camps. At least a handful, there were 10 total in the United States, and at least 2 were on reservations on indigenous land. So I don't know if that's true for all of them. I actually just heard this for the first time a few days ago, so I haven't looked into it too much, but worth noting, okay? But so, under this executive order, 110,000 individuals were relocated to camps. The buildings that were used were often former horse stables or barracks, okay? And this began in February of 1942 and would go on through the end of the war, okay? So like I said, did I give an exact number? Substantial majority of those who were detained in internment camps were American citizens. Okay, so 2/3 of that 110,000. And in these internment camps, it was ruled as under a quasi-military discipline. Okay, yes, this was a military excursion. Okay, so internment revealed how easily war can undermine basic freedoms. All right, this, was suggested and people kind of jumped on board with it. So, anyway. People can support, anyway. Okay, so, Okay, so internment revealed how easily war can undermine basic freedoms, and hardly anyone spoke out against the internment. All right. Courts refused to intervene, and this chapter of U.S. history is often either pushed aside, not talked about a whole lot, but I feel like it's something that we are beginning to discuss more and more as time goes on. But anyway, okay. 20,000 Japanese Americans joined the armed forces from these camps. While they were being interned, they were still joining the military, okay, still, and, you know, they were having to sign contracts pledging their allegiance to the United States, okay, while they're being forcibly detained. But anyway, so 20,000 Japanese Americans join out of those camps, 13,000 from Hawaii. And for this, the government would officially or finally apologize in 1988. Okay, so like I said, this wasn't discussed for a long time, being formally recognized in the 80s. Okay. Okay, let me just take a little swig real quick. Okay, moving on, let's look at African Americans in the war. So the wartime message of freedom introduced a major transformation in the status of African Americans, which will pretty soon after the war is over, as soon as we get into the 1950s, we'll start to talk about this, but the rise of the civil rights movement coming out of the South particularly, okay? But so this wartime message and this promotion of freedom will really encourage the movement to, which had been going on for generations. It wasn't anything new, but it will kind of give it, it'll be a revitalization, okay? Okay, so during the war, over 1 million African Americans served in the armed forces in segregated units, and so this will be our last armed conflict where that will happen, okay? Seeing segregated units. So from the Korean War on, so Korean War, Vietnam, etc., we will have integrated units. But so this is the tail end of the use of segregated units. And okay, so yeah, African American veterans returned home to racial discrimination, which, like I said, will cause more of a dialogue leading up to this revitalization within the civil rights movement, okay? Okay, and the GI Bill ultimately, which was ultimately left to local legislation, would very negatively impact people in particular regions. Think of the South, okay? So, left up to local legislation. So the benefits that our soldiers receive as they are coming back from war is varied, okay? Okay, here we go. So like I said, this conversation as the war is ending leads to, that spark that will bring about the civil rights movement kind of as we know it and what we consider to be the true, kind of the beginning of it, okay? Okie dokie. So the war years witnessed the birth of the modern civil rights movement. Oops, I got a notification. Close that. Okay, we have the passage of Executive Order 8802. So this is the Fair Employment Practices Commission creation, which barred discrimination in defense jobs based on race. So like I said, this is the last war where we would have the segregated units. This executive order helps bring about that end, okay? Okay, so the FEPC is what that is known as, played a significant role in securing industrial jobs for African American workers. So 1 million workers, 300,000 of which were women, gained manufacturing jobs as a result of this executive order, okay? Okay, so the end of the war. Alrighty, so we are at the tail end of 1944, looking at the beginning of 1945. Okay, so as 1945 opened, an Allied victory was assured. So remember, nobody thought Germany could be beat early on. That shifts as the U.S. gets involved. So by 1944, people were pretty sure that Germany's on the decline, okay? Okay, December 1944, Hitler launched a counterattack in France. Remember, they had been there. D-Day, they push Germany back out. So 1944, in December, Germany is trying to get back into France, okay? Okay, they launch a counterattack in France that pushed Allied forces back, and this creates a bulge, all right? So this bulge in mid-France. So as Americans entered Germany, Hitler committed suicide, and the Soviets take Berlin coming from the east, okay? So May 8th, 1945, this is considered to be the end of the war from the Western Front, okay, so against Germany. So the war in the Pacific will continue. But so Germany's defeated. Now everyone's focusing on defeating the Japanese. And this had been going on for a while, but the Manhattan Project, which had been developed to create the atomic bomb, which started in 1940 under FDR's approval. The Manhattan Project is then being seen as the end-all be-all. Is that how that expression goes? Be-all, end-all be-all. Weird. Sorry, brain fart. But anyway, so this becomes the big focus of how to end the war on the Pacific side, okay? Okie dokie. The dawn of the atomic age, which will define, the Cold War and all of the fear that comes out of that. But so the dawn of the atomic age is what starts all of that, okay? So August 6th, 1945, an American plane dropped an atomic bomb that detonated over Hiroshima in Japan. Of 280,000 civilians and 40,000 soldiers impacted, 70,000 died immediately, instantaneously. Radiation led the death toll to rise to 140,000 by the end of the year. Okay. So our first bomb is detonated on the 6th. The 9th, a second bomb is dropped. So the first one was, obviously that is an aggressive act, but it was considered to be a threat, saying, we can do this, but if you don't lay off whenever the second bomb is dropped, this was saying, we can keep doing this if this war continues, okay? So first bomb is dropped on the 6th, second bomb is dropped on the 9th over Nagasaki. And so we'll get to the end of the war in a second. But so with the second bomb, again, 70,000 people die instantly, okay? So that day, on the 9th, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria, which had been occupied, and the Japanese surrender, okay? So again, first bomb's considered to be a threat, even though it is a nuclear bomb that has been detonated. So with the second bomb, they're like, okay, we're done, okay? So Japan surrenders. And because of the enormous cost of civilian lives, the use of the bomb remains controversial today. That's why we have conversations about nuclear power. This would mostly increase through the 70s and 80s, and then the anti-nuclear movement will kind of bring an end to that eventually. And there are nuclear meltdowns that happen. But anyway, but this is the beginning of our atomic age, okay? Okay, use of the bomb remains controversial. Okay, our last slide, let us talk about the United Nations. So there is the Dumbarton Oaks meeting that occurred in D.C., Washington, D.C. in 1944. that established the structure of what becomes the United Nations. Okay, it's a General Assembly, it's a Security Council, and this was set up between Britain, China, France, the United States, and Soviet Union. Adopted globally in July of 1949, so tail end of the war. Okay. Oh, and then peace, but not harmony is the last little talking point I have here. But so World War II ended with the U.S. as the world's dominant power, and that will create issues in and of itself, which we will see, because anytime there's a dominant power, there will always be a power struggle not far behind. And we will see that with the Soviet Union getting into chapter 23. Okay, so that is, World War II in a pretty quick little nutshell. If you all have any questions, please email me, and otherwise I will see you back for chapter 23. Okay, talk to you soon. Bye.